I would like to, first of all, to thank you for this introduction and also for this invitation. I have to say that I have never met Ghassan Kanafani, although we did, in fact, overlap in Beirut. The only close connection I've had with him physically, if you like, is a couple of months ago when I went to the cemetery in Shatila and I saw his grave. And very close to it, his niece's grave as well. So that otherwise I never managed to meet him earlier. Now, I'm afraid this is going to be a rather unacademic talk because it's all happened a long time ago. I acquired Rijal fi Shams in 1970 in Beirut. In fact, it was a rather strange occasion because I was working on my thesis in Egypt, in Cairo, and Egypt in the year 1967, 1970 was a very oppressive place to be, not really so much for me as for the Egyptians, because of course Nasser's whole ideological program had been shown up as empty. And during this year, I was offered a trip to Beirut by a journalist friend because she wanted some money. I think she didn't tell me, but I think she was probably buying some antiquity and she needed the cash. I jumped at the chance to go away to Beirut with my fare paid and 3 nights in a hotel. And so I went to Beirut. I saw some friends, had a nice time. This was Beirut before the Civil War. And I bought some books. And I think one of the books in one of the bookshops, I'm sure the bookseller said to me, "This is something you'll be interested in," and gave me a copy of Rijal fi Shams. And then I packed in rather a hurry when I had to go back to Cairo. And I got to the airport in time, checked my suitcase in. And while I was sitting in the plane, while we were flying towards Cairo, I realized that I'd put the money in the suitcase. And all the suitcases were searched. It was an automatic thing. So I was thinking to myself, my God, how can I explain this money? Well, I didn't have an answer to that. And we arrived at Cairo Airport, disembarked. I saw my suitcase coming along on a conveyor belt, and a customs official stopped it and opened it. And he looked at me and he said, "You read Arabic?" Because although I put the money in the suitcase, the last thing I'd put in was the Arabic books I'd bought in Beirut. So in a sense, Rijal fi Shams and a whole lot of other books really saved me from an extremely difficult situation, not just for me, in fact, but also for my journalist friend. Now, I didn't actually read Rijal fi Shams then because I was working on Egyptian novels. It was after I'd finished my thesis, I think in probably 1972, that I read it, and I thought to myself immediately, this book has to be translated. If you think back to 1972 or 9 to that period, I mean, you'd had Golda Meir saying there are no such things as Palestinians, and there was a great deal less understanding of the Palestinian side of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict than there is now. The influence of the recollections of the Second World War was much stronger. Anyway, I thought to myself, I have to translate this book, and then I had an opportunity to do so in a couple of years later when I was working at the BBC in the Arabic service. I started working in 1973 after the October War, and people didn't have too much to do then because the BBC had taken on a lot of staff for the October War, and after the war, there was much less to do. And quite a lot of my colleagues would go down to the bar and prop it up and spend time. And I thought, well, that's not a very interesting way of spending the time. not very productive. So I went and started to translate Rochelle Ficham's. And it was an ideal situation because I had a typewriter, I had as much paper as I wanted, and if I really had problems, I could ask my Arab colleagues. And so I got on with it. The question was then to find a publisher, because I'd started publishing it, translating it without thinking of a publisher. And somebody suggested to me to get in touch with Heinemann's, because they had at the time this Arab authors series. I don't know if you, I mean, I don't know how well known that is now, but at the time, it was one of the main outlets for translations of Arabic literature, modern Arabic literature in English. And so I got in touch with the person, the editor of that series, James Curry. And first of all, there was a problem because Rochelle Ficham's is too short for the average British or even maybe English language publication. So he said to me, well, we need a few more stories, and that's why there are the other stories in it. And when I got together some more stories, he wanted to be sure that it was an acceptable translation. And so he sent it to Jabra Ibrahim Shabra. And the other day, I dug up the letter which Jabra sent, and where he says, in fact, he thought it was the translation was quite acceptable. What he drew the line at, or what he criticized rather, were a couple of things that I'd said in the introduction. For instance, I had written that Kanafani was the foremost Palestinian writer in prose. Now, Jabra, of course, himself, it was a couple of years later, it was 1977, and Jabra, of course, himself ought to have been included in such a description, and of course, Emil Habibi. So, I mean, I was not really quite right about that, and I think I probably changed it after his remark. But anyway, and then the book, in fact, was published in 1978. That was the first publishing. It's quite hard to check up because in the original contract, the royalties were divided between me and the Ghassan Kanafani Foundation. But at a certain stage, it wasn't a lot of money. I mean, it was really not significant for me, but I thought for Ghassan Kanafani Foundation, with their work with kindergartens in the Palestinian refugee camps, every penny counted. So I wrote to the publisher and I said, just pay all the royalties to the foundation, which is what they did. So that means that I didn't, after that, know when the book was republished. But the dates I've been able to find are 1983, 1991, 1998, and 1999. And my son, who was in Palestine not so long ago, has actually found a pirate copy, which is at least on in the West Bank, available on the West Bank. Now, it's really quite hard for me to talk about the translation now, because one thing is that we were, in those days, so in the early 70s, not really conscious of translation studies. It hadn't developed as a proper discipline, really. And, so there wasn't very much reflection on how does one translate. And in my case, I think another reason was I had read masses of Egyptian novels and short stories. And so it wasn't, to me, there were maybe problems that I had come across already in things I read. Of course, translating is a different thing from just reading, but still, it was not really a difficult problem. There were not really many problems that I was confronted with in translating Rijal for Shams. I mean, there were one or two technical things, like I remember I didn't recognize H4. You know, he talks about the pumping stations, and seeing that in Arabic, I mean, it didn't relate to anything I'd seen before. But as I say, otherwise, it was not difficult. I think also because Kanafani's style is quite sparse, and he has a lot of visual imagery, which if you try to visualize it yourself, then you can put it into your own language. Very often I had the feeling of trying to be just a fly on the wall in what was being described, discussed, whatever, and trying to put it then into English. It helped, of course, that I had some idea of Palestinian experience, because before I went to Egypt, I had spent a year teaching in the Lebanon, and it was a private school, and I had Palestinian colleagues who had come to Palestine come to Lebanon as refugees, you know, as small children, and had gone through the UNRWA school system, and then had studied at AUB, and really, you know, had a successful start in life thanks to that. But it was still clear that they were suffering from awful restrictions in Lebanon. So, but as I say, that gave me an idea of the kind of background, of some kind of background that Kanafani came from. I mean, I've been looking at it, you know, since your invitation. I've been looking at it, the translation, and think to myself, well, there are things I might change now, but on the whole, it seems that, you know, people still read the translation. But of course, that is really because of Kanafani. It's not because of me. I mean, Kanafani is a very important writer, a very gifted writer. And I was lucky to be able to, you know, try and transmit what he was trying to say into English. Yes, recently, though, when I mentioned I'd been just in Lebanon, and I had an interesting experience because a doctoral student got in touch with me. He's working in translation studies. And so he wanted to ask me questions about why I'd translated certain things in Rijal for Shams into English. And there was a difficulty, actually, because his background of English is American English. And my background of English, as you can hear, is British English, and of course also mostly British English of some decades ago. So there were difficulties in that, you know, slight things we could discuss about. Another thing which I found very interesting was that he expected more. He would, I think, have liked more footnotes in the translation, because he felt there was not enough in the way of sort of cultural expectations. Now, I think that, again, partly has to do with the fact that American English and British English are not the same. But also, I think, because at the time when I translated that, and it's maybe still true in Britain, that there's a certain residue of different strata of English which have come in with the colonial experience. And so there were certain things that you didn't need to explain, whereas maybe to the you know, 21st century American reader, they are not obvious. You know, so I think one thing was it was Imam that he thought I might have made some explanation for us. Anyway, I can't remember another example, but that was something that I found interesting. The most interesting thing, though, was when he asked me why I'd added something to Kanafani's text. So I said to him, no, I haven't added anything, because he had been comparing my translation with an edition of Rijal fi Shams from 2012, I think. And so there's a phrase which comes in the English translation. It's when Abu Ghazran has has discovered that his 3 passengers have suffocated in the system, the lorry system. And so he says, and then he curses these Kuwaitis who kept him chatting in the sun, which is why the men died. And he says, the curse of Almighty God, who doesn't exist anywhere, be visited upon you, Abu Bakr. Now that's the English. And the Arabic original is, original from the text I was working with, is Ya la'natu ilahi alladhi la yujadu qat fi ayyi makanin tansabbu alayk ya Abu Bakr. So he's in fact, Kanafani, this is clear also from 1 or 2 other phrases in the book, was emphasizing a fairly a-religious standpoint. And the edition of 2012 had simply left that phrase out. They felt it didn't go down well with, I suppose, the early 21st century readers. It would be worth, I think he probably, that was the only instance he mentioned, and I think he probably didn't find anything else, but it is actually a question, and I've come across it in other connections, that when people say, when books are presented as being a reprint, maybe not everything is still there. And I'll give you an example which is much less ideologically connotated. I was looking at an edition of the History of Egypt by Al-Jabarti, who's an early 19th century author. And the old version of this has a whole lot of poetry in it. But the republished edition in, I don't know when it came out, but some late 20th century, has simply left the poetry out. I think they thought, well, this is history, so the poetry is irrelevant. But so it's just a word of warning, when you're dealing with Arabic texts and you've got a reprinted version, just think to yourself, might there be something else which you haven't been told about? Now, that is all I can really say about translating Ghassan Kanafani, except that I'm very grateful to have been involved in being able to do it. It's been also a pleasure that every so often, when I've had contact with younger scholars, particularly from the States, they say, when I was in my, starting to learn Arabic or was interested in Middle Eastern studies to begin with, this is one of the texts I read in English. So I thought to myself, well, it's been very useful. Thank you.